debt. And his day job, he works for the Coastal Livelihood and Environmental Action Network, or CLEAN, and is on one of the international committee members of the NGO Forum on the ADB. Thirdly, I'd like to welcome Rodolfo Lahoy Jr. Rodolfo is a policy officer at IBON International, a Southern-based civil society organization engaged in capacity development for people's rights and democracy. IBON International works on debt and other financing for development issues from the perspective of working peoples, especially in the global south, and he joins us from Manila. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Emeline Siale Ilolahia. I apologize if I didn't get that right. Siale is the Executive Director of PIANGO, the Pacific Island Association of Non-Government Organizations. She represents the interests of Pacific civil society in a range of regional and international fora. She's a Tongan civil society leader and women's advocate and activist, and she's been involved in bringing together coalitions to work on issues such as ethical leadership, women's access to finance, women's leadership, political participation, and deep sea mining. So welcome everyone, and so pleased that the four of you could join us. I'm going to turn first to Iolanda and ask a couple of questions of you, Iolanda. I was hoping that you could provide some context to the issues that we're now facing. So before we start to talk about the COVID crisis, I wonder if you can talk to us, Iolanda, for a few minutes about the situation and the trends in sovereign debt before the COVID crisis hit, and the, sort of the recent developments there before we talk about COVID.
Yeah, thank you, Luke. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me, well, us from Eurodad. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. We tend to say that the COVID crisis has kind of triggered a debt crisis that was already there. On February 20th at Eurodad, we published a report specifically denouncing the debt crisis that was unfolding in the global south, and that is before the whole pandemic became an actual pandemic. Just a few data: between 2010 and 2018, external debt payments from countries in the global south grew by 83% only in 8 years, up to 12.5% in 2018. This means that more than 12% of the incomings of the revenue of developing countries' governments were for paying external debts and interests. This is because the borrowing had been increasing, especially after 2010, but also because the costs of the borrowing for developing countries was increasing, mainly due to an increased lending from financial markets and private lenders to the countries in the global south. For instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, the proportion of government revenue destined to external debt service more than doubled in only 8 years. And we found out that in more than 20 countries globally, well, in the global south, more than 20% of the revenue was actually spent on debt service in 2018. This is the last data we had at the moment of publishing our report, but since 2018 that this has been increasing. This means that countries in the global south before the COVID were already spending more and more resources on paying their external debt and less resources in their public services. In more than 20 countries, in low and middle income countries, government education expenditure as a percentage of GDP actually decreased while debt service payments were increasing. So while expenses in education and in health were decreasing, expenditure in paying the external debt was increasing. This is not only us who are saying this, not only civil society, but the IMF and the World Bank were also alerting of this new debt crisis or new wave of debt, as the World Bank posted in January this year. The World Bank called this recent surge of external debt in developing countries the largest, fastest, and most broad-based debt crisis in nearly 5 decades. So the alarm was there, the signs that we were facing a situation that could put us back to the 70s or 80s and 90s debt crisis were already there before the COVID-19 came into place, which has made things much, much worse.
Thanks, Iolanda. I'll ask you a follow-up question, if I may. So what would you say are the forces from the COVID crisis that have made the situation worse? And, you know, in terms of the data and indicators, what do they reveal about how much worse things have got in the last few months? And yeah, if you could talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, and there is a multiplication of factors that actually are worsening the situation. The first is that developing countries are seeing a sharp decline in export revenue because of the halt in global trade, because the exports have actually decreased, but also due to the collapse in commodity prices, such as copper or oil. This shows the high dependence of impoverished countries with global trade, which is something that was imposed upon those countries by the colonial forces, and also demonstrates how vulnerable these countries are to exogenous shocks. So this is not a crisis that they have any responsibility into. Additional to the decrease in revenues due to exports, there's also a sudden stop in tourism. This is affecting many countries, but especially small island developing states and in Asia and the Pacific. You know a lot about that dependency on the tourist sector can be deadly in a situation like this one. And also a sharp increase in remittances from migrant workers. This also shows how hardly hit are migrant workers in both emerging and global north countries. And finally, a capital outflow, the capital flight from developing and emerging countries that has hit record numbers, more than $100 billion, $100 billion from in the first 2 months of the pandemic flew out of the developing countries and emerging countries, and this is being coupled by also a decrease in foreign investment. All these forces, together with the need for increasing expenditures to cope with the health crisis, the social crisis, and this economic crisis, is increasing fiscal deficits, which means that countries actually need to borrow more to get more funding or more financing from international cooperation. And they are actually paying more for this new financing when they reach out to the capital markets, of course. So the indicators would be this increase in the debt cost, in the interest that they are paying. In some countries, this is reaching numbers like 8-9% of interest. We still don't have the data for all the countries. And just some numbers, for instance, Jubilee Tech Campaign just made a calculation for the group of the 76 countries that could benefit from this debt service suspension initiative that we will probably talk later. They are paying a total of $40 billion only in 2020 on external debt service. 10 billion of these external debt payments are going to private creditors. This means that the financing they are receiving from the IMF, from international donors, from debt relief could go directly to those private creditors, not to covering the health crisis or the social needs of the population. That is one of the big differences between this crisis and the crisis in the 80s or the 90s, which means that private creditors, and it's not only banks, it's investors, it's capital markets, financial markets, have a key role because there's been an increase in bond issuing in the global south. And this means that most of these countries will have to negotiate restructuring or debt relief or refinancing those debts with this abstract financial markets, and will have to pay whatever it takes to those financial markets if we don't put a solution into this situation. We still don't have all the data that we would like, because there is it's very cynical when IMF, World Bank, and bilateral lenders have been asking for transparency and debt statistics to the global south countries, but they do not publish their own data. So we've been calling for many years now for a registry of external debt, of loans and bonds. So we are number crunching and trying to find out the extent of this crisis. But the data we have shows that the situation could get actually worse in 2021 and 2022, because most of these debt payments to private creditors are due in the next 2 or 3 years, not only in 2020, but also in 2021, 2022, and 2023.
Thanks, Iolanda. I might, that's really, really helpful. I might just stop you there because that's a really great summary. And it's really provided a good context for the rest of the discussion. So thank you so much. And we'll obviously be coming back to you with more contributions. I just want to turn to Rodolfo next. Rodolfo, I know that your analysis is that this current situation that Iolanda has laid out for us is connected with broader systemic failures of the global financial system. And I was wondering if you can walk us through that a little bit and tell us about the connection between the debt problems and the other failures of the international financial system.
Yes, thanks, Luke, and thank you, Iolanda, for actually describing the context of our predicament very well. Yes, my answer to that question is first, it is the debt problem today is indeed a systemic issue. I have 3 related points when it comes to this. First of all, that the relation between international creditors and lenders, international creditors and debtors, has never been equal. The creditor has the capital, who wishes to circulate and accumulate capital, and who expect debt to come with future gains precisely via interest, for instance. On the other hand, there are governments who rely on foreign sources, on foreign capital as their primary source of so-called development financing. So that's my first point. My second point is that how the debt problem, I argue, this grew in tandem with how neoliberal norms have become widespread among southern governments. This is with the reliance of southern governments on foreign capital, on currencies of advanced economies, of which loans are one form of foreign capital. So in the end, these affect the peoples in the South negatively, no? So for instance, I could mention two neoliberal norms that I think are very relevant. I could mention how capital market liberalization has been pushed by the IMF, by the World Bank, by the ADB on southern countries, and how the deregulation of capital flows were precisely pushed. So as these are the systemic, the institutional factors that enabled what Iolanda has been mentioning earlier about how the capital markets in the South became a playground for private lenders. No, this is also connected to what she said about how after 2010, private lenders flocked to the global South in the name of higher returns, and southern countries were very open. Their financial markets were precisely opened for these foreign capital sources. And this is the same policy norm that is now enabling the capital outflow in general. No? What Iolanda said about the vast capital outflow out of the South amid the pandemic and recession today. And another systemic institutional factor is trade liberalization. No? And again, I will connect this to what Iolanda said. I think there is the circle, the vicious cycle of borrowing and extractivism in many southern countries, precisely the commodity-dependent countries that Iolanda was mentioning. And that explains how in the time of volatile commodity prices, in the time of trade stoppages, this circuit of borrowing and paying for these borrowings via foreign currency gained from exporting minerals, exporting agricultural commodities, exporting energy commodities. Once this circuit has stopped, suddenly, well, not suddenly, structurally, many southern countries now find themselves in that barren land without foreign currency. And that also drives them now to turn more to multilateral lenders, such as the IMF. And this is precisely my third point, that many of the institutions that have been driving us to these norms, these neoliberal norms, which you may add the labor export policy that drove the dependence on remittances, the foreign investment liberalization that made economies dependent on foreign capital. These norms are pushed by the same, have been and are still being pushed by the institutions that are now offering us more debts, even if these are supposedly of a concessional nature. And and we as peoples in the South, as I've said, we carry the burden of these debts. We are being obliged by our government to foot the bill in terms of regressive taxation on poorer social classes, the effects of debt-funded infrastructure on our farming communities, on our indigenous communities. So the debt problem today, to expound on the second point, is a manifestation of how the ladder for people's development has been kicked away. I perhaps some of us here have already heard of the term kicking away the development ladder. How southern countries were precisely prevented by advanced economies from pursuing the development models that the advanced economies used when they were still emerging. So that is a manifestation of this, of how we were made to be dependent on foreign finance, and we were prevented from having strategic industrial policy, agricultural development by what Yolanda said as the former colonial powers and the institutions that followed them.
Rodolfo,
Yeah.
can I just jump in there? Thank you for that, for drawing those connections. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about some of the countries you know well, especially the Philippines. Maybe a couple. We're about to hear from Bangladesh, but I know you're also interested in some other South Asian countries. How this crisis is playing out, the 2020 crisis we're seeing, how it's playing out in a couple of case studies for us.
Yeah, sure. I could talk about that. I could point, for example, well, I could point, this is not a South Asian country, but I could point out Mongolia precisely as an example of a case of how the circuit of borrowing and extractivism was suddenly interrupted by the trade stoppages amid the recession and pandemic, because Mongolia is well, 98% of its merchandise exports are primary commodities. Particularly of that 94%, 64% are exports of minerals such as copper. So they are very dependent on exporting copper to gain foreign currency for paying external debts. No? And this is precisely, as I've said, this has a huge role in their long-running debt problem. Mongolia has an external debt stock of 254% of its GNI, and it has the highest level of external debt among landlocked LDCs. And in 2018, debt servicing was more than 100% of Mongolia's export earnings, mostly indeed from mineral exports. And amid the crisis, how the Chinese economy closed down for a while was affected. This affected Mongolia because 85% of mineral exports of Mongolia go to China. So there's that, in that example, that interruption of that circuit of borrowing and extractivism. And now Mongolia, just I think last June 6th, Mongolia had to turn again to the IMF for a 99 million loan to amidst this dearth of foreign capital. So that's one example. I could also talk a bit about Pakistan briefly on how its current crisis is actually a long-running crisis, because Pakistan has this vicious cycle of reliance on debt. In 2019, for instance, it sought 6 billion of an emergency loan to the IMF. It's not the first bailout of Pakistan with the IMF, definitely not. It's actually the 13th, 1-3, the 13th loan that Pakistan had to seek from the IMF because it has debt troubles. No? And this is actually a conditional loan on condition of new taxes, of using the money to pay debts such as to China, etc. So now Pakistan remains in this vicious circle of debts. No? It is precisely in the news today because it participated in the debt service suspension initiative of the G20 amid the lockdowns and the impacts on its economy. So it supposedly would save around 2.75 billion in that short period of debt suspension. But again, maybe we'll talk about this later. No? That indeed these responses are not enough because for one, they are short term and they would not really cover the significant amounts necessitated by this crisis. So that's my second example, Pakistan.
Thanks, Rodolfo. I think let's stay in South Asia. Thank you for those two examples, and we will come back to what to do. But I'd like to stay in South Asia, but move to Bangladesh. And Mehdi, we've heard some really fascinating sort of global analyses and historical analysis of the situation, but it would be great to sort of hear a more on the ground perspective. So I wanted to ask you about what the situation is like right now in Bangladesh. Can you tell us about what life is like there in the last few months since COVID crisis has broken out? What impact the global retraction and the lockdown has had on the health system and the economy in Bangladesh?
Thank you. First of all, Iolanda and Rodolfo, both of them covered most of the thing which I should say also. I will just focus on Bangladesh itself, the country, because many of the issues are covered, which are regional and global. Bangladesh is a poster boy of development since 1991. I should give some very precise data. Data like the population is 167 million here. The density of population is 1,150 per square kilometer. Under poverty line people is around 30 million. According to the recent studies, newly added under the poverty line is 1.14 million more. Total labor force, 93% of the total labor force are in non-formal sector. In agriculture, 18 million families are involved in agriculture, which is 47% of total domestic labor force. 8 million are in garment sector, in the dress making sector, which is 21% of total domestic labor force, and expatriate labors like in Middle East majorly and in Malaysia majorly. It's around 9 million are staying outside. So income from garment sector is reduced. After on March 18, we got first case of COVID-19 in Bangladesh, in Dhaka. So after that, income from garment sector reduced from 29 million a month to only 3 million a month. Remittance reduced from 30 million a month to only 4.5 million a month in March, April, May, and June. Laborers from Middle Eastern countries started coming back, and 700,000 laborers have come back from Middle East in last 3.5 months. Domestic market is facing serious problems, especially in during the festival period. 2 festivals has already gone. One is Bengali New Year and Eid, the Muslims Eid festival. The retailers could not sell even 10% of their products. So the retailers and small and medium enterprises are facing serious problem. Government has been trying to balance between safety measures and economic activities. So there are so many indecisions between that, which hampered from the both sides. Government couldn't control the pandemic and couldn't control the economic situation also. So national budget has been shrinked, and estimated growth of this year is around 3%, which was 8.3% last fiscal year. So this is the overall picture. So since March 2020, and since today, yesterday, 24th June, in 3 months, 16 days, the number of total affected people are now 122,660, and total death toll is 1,582. According to the independent sources, the number are at least twice of this official declaration. Testing, average testing is around 0.02% a day, and per million testing is in Maldives, it's 65,000. In Malaysia, it's 21,000, some more. In Nepal, it's 15,000. In Thailand, it's 6,700. In Sri Lanka, it's 4,400. In India, it's 5,038 average. And in Bangladesh, it's 3,703, which is lowest in the developing and near advanced developed countries. Hospital beds. In Maldives, it's 4.3 per 1,000 people. In Malaysia, it's 1.98. In Thailand, it's 2.35. In Sri Lanka, it's 3.60. In Nepal, it's 0.3 per 1,000 people. In India, 1.10. And in Bangladesh, it's 0.7 per 1,000 people, which is only higher than Nepal. So this is the situation, and the very now is around 18 million farmers have lost their capacity of further investment for agriculture, as most of them are either a small producer or sharecroppers. Newly added 1.1 million skilled labor from Middle East and Malaysia is looking for job, and they are totally out of employment now. Large international buyers like from Australia, from United States, from Germany, from Italy, and from UK, they are creating pressure on the local producers, garment producers, to stop supply or to reduce price or to give them on credit for more than 1 year. So this is one scenario. For this situation, many of the garments workers are unemployed. Around 8 million people are involved with the garment sector here. Collected samples for test are almost thrice of capacity now. So, so the capacity is around 31,991, while the laboratories are testing some 20,000 a day now.
Mehedi, can I jump in there? Because it's really, really helpful to have this really granular exposition of what's happening in Bangladesh. But I wanted to ask you a little bit as well about what implications this has had for the finances of the country. And can you tell us a bit about what Bangladesh's debt situation is, given all of these economic and health retractions and reversals?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
One thing is our total debt received now $58.32 billion, and total repaid is $25.11 billion, and outstanding is now $40 billion total. And now in national budget, just a few days earlier, the finance minister submitted the national budget to the parliament, and according to the budget, 10.9% of the total budget is going to repay the external and domestic debts, whereas budget allocation for agriculture is 2.69%, health is 4.9%, for food supply it's 0.9%, and for power sector it's 5.4%. So it's loan repayment is more than double of power sector, more than 5 times more than the agriculture sector. That's the repayment. And who are the financier in Bangladesh? Along with the IMF, World Bank, ADB, and AIIB, the major financiers are China first, Japan second, India third, Russia, and USA. They have the different geopolitical interest to invest in Bangladesh. All of the countries have different Bay of Bengal project. So this year government has to pay around $6.87 billion as installments of domestic and external loan. Among the amount, the government has to pay $3.7 billion to the bilateral multilateral financiers. The government has to pay another $1.2 billion for the private power companies as capacity charge for the ideal power plants, as the country is facing overcapacity in power sector. And these all money has come from China, India, or Korea, or Russia. This is the in very short the situation of Bangladesh. the government needs now around 8.8 billion to face the negative impacts of COVID-19, especially health system, food security, and employment of of the non-formal sector. In this situation, Asian Development Bank, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, World Bank, and IMF, they should have cancelled their own loan repayments. But World Bank and IMF called developed countries to cancel the repayment, but they have not. That is which is hypocrisy. And in this uh, situation, they have given new loans: ADB $750 million, AIB $250 million, World Bank $350 million, and IMF $800 million. So total, it's $2.3 billion on the shoulder of the poor people of Bangladesh in this pandemic. That's what I want to share now.
Thanks, Mehdi. Yeah, it's really it's sort of really interesting to hear a complex case study of the kinds of trends and that Iolanda and Rodolfo were talking about. So thank you so much for talking us through that. And I know I've learned a lot about Bangladesh that I didn't know. We'll come back to you as with the others, but I want to move now eastward direction towards the Pacific. And Siale, I was hoping that you might give the webinar a description of the ways that the COVID crisis, and in particular the closing of the borders, have affected Pacific Island countries. And I know that the loss of tourism and remittances has been serious there. So what's happening in Pacific, and do you think the situation will get worse in terms of sovereign debt?
Thank you, Luke. It's good to be here, and thank you for inviting me to speak on behalf of Piango Network that's present in 24 countries and territories of the Pacific. Most of our network are umbrella NGOs, civil society in those countries. It's across the Pacific that we felt the impact of COVID-19, particularly in the sector of tourism, and not just tourism, but also because it's not just the Pacific that is that felt the impact of COVID-19, but across the world. So the remittances that are often has become a resilience modality for our Pacific communities, where a lot of our diaspora communities are in Australia, New Zealand, and the States, in some of the other countries in the world, is also affected. We also have labor mobility, seasonal working schemes that has our people go to Australia and New Zealand. With the lockdown, some of them are there, and you know it has impact in terms of the productions of the different farmers and in place of work that they had been placed. So it's a huge impact. The tourism, we have seen a lot of our Pacific people losing their jobs, and it's a different context to different countries. Some are being informed ahead of time. Majority, they just find out that they lose their job. Probably they heard it from the news before they're being advised by their employer. And we have seen our different government leaning more to protect the businesses in making sure that they don't have to face legal obligations to some of these our people from the private sector as well, in terms of the losing their jobs at different platform that they're working in. So it's a complicated different context to different communities, but the impact of it is felt across the Pacific. But I think the most important thing that we have seen is that how COVID-19 has kind of exposed the social protections of our Pacific communities, um, which uh, um, it was there, and we have seen that the narrative and the conversation now is moving towards um, a new normal, like trying to um, to define what's the new normal is going to look like. Um, but what civil society is now reminded or part of the conversation that we have now is that we cannot move to a new normal without recognizing what has been the old normal, what has been the system that has seems not to be prioritizing the interest of the community, interest of our vulnerable communities, our vulnerable populations, our women, disability, our young people, rural communities, informal settlements, where the lockdown of COVID-19 still find that our organizations and civil society organization that has gone out to make sure that they have share the COVID-19 information to keep their community safe, still find that water and sanitation is still an issue, that communities are not access to clean water. Um, electricity is still an issue that, so those basic, very basic human rights of our communities are not there. And then we have to ask the questions, of all these years with all the aid support money that are coming to our government to look into addressing poverty in our society, what has been the impact of those work? So it's quite interesting then to see how COVID-19 is exposing some of those social protection system, our health system, our education, food security, livelihood, and then you also look into the different economic model that has been shifted our communities and our Pacific countries towards much more driven by trade, driven by economic development, the investment that has seen some of our communities being displaced because the communal land has been given to investors to build five stars hotel or develop into something that invested interest from corporate the corporate capture um, has been um, emerged to be a lot more of interest from civil society and our community to talk about those things now. And I would say that it's getting to be a lot more involved in communities, our traditional leaders, our traditional systems, are now having conversations around rethinking and even our churches are now part of a conversations around relooking what development should look like in our region. But then at the same time, for Piango and our network in the civil society in our region, um, we had to revisit this whole conversations around development effectiveness, the Istanbul Principle, the Busan Partnership for Development Effectiveness, which has given civil society the mandate that we are development actors in our own rights. And we had not seen that being translated from the global to our Pacific countries. and it has been, we had seen the shift from our national priorities to economic development, and has undermined the social protection system that being the resilience of our communities that has been exposed by COVID-19. When we talk about climate change, for example, then we will see the first responded to any impact of climate change. We have seen, um, you know, numerous cyclones, volcano eruptions. Um, it's really our community that are first responders to some of those impact of climate change. Yet we don't see the connections between the funds that are coming to address climate change in our communities, to what has been the discussions at the national level. And I would give an example of a public finance management projects that we are engaged with, supported by you and the UNDP, which we had start to push for civil society to look into where the money goes in national budget. And one example that we have just did one exercise to look into the climate change budget in the national budget of Tonga, which they've just approved it. And what comes out quite interesting is that of the line budget that has been identified to support or to address the impact of negative impact of climate change, a lot of that is focusing on infrastructure and energy, renewable energy. The socio-economic aspects of people and natural resources resilient is largely absent. And so that's an indications, but then at the same time, when you look into the policy narratives of the budget, of the national budget, it's indicated that it support communities, women and youth and vulnerable groups to access relevant funding to help them with their community priorities. So you have something that you have the policy at one side, and then in terms of the actual allocations of funds in the budget doesn't seem to match. Yeah, and so that gaps continue to be, and this is just an example from Tonga. We are yet to do a same exercise to the rest of our region. But I would say that it wouldn't be any difference. So it seems that has indications that we often see the climate change issue are being taken to the global level and talked about. And then when the funds comes in, it's directed to something else, and it's not going directly to the policy narrative that we often see that are used by government, is to address the vulnerability of our communities. So it's just being used to attract fund, but it doesn't really seems to come and flow down to the actual interest of our communities. So if I could finish off by just saying that what we really need to be quite mindful of, or we need to push for from civil society, is that whatever this whole cycle of the gaps between policy, gaps between the funding coming in, and how the different priorities, we have to make sure that we call for due diligence, we call for accountability, and we call for transparency, so that we can be able to track where the funds goes, where the money goes, make sure that it's going to address empower the resilience of our community, and make sure that our community are the core of that. And then you still see that a lot of these discussions, the core, the community who are really facing the negative impact of climate change are not in the are not at the table to be part of these discussions, or are not around to be co-creating or co-designing what's the next level of our resilience, what's the next level of our new normal.
Thank you. Thanks, Siale. I'm just going to stop you there because you've led us right into where I wanted to go, which is to start talking about solutions. So it's really interesting to hear you talk about accountability and accountability of financing, and draw those connections between the financial struggles that Pacific Island nations are facing and the lack of accountability of financing coming in. So I want to turn to solutions, and I'm going to ask the speakers to try and limit their answers to 3 minutes now, because we're going to just have about 15 minutes now to talk about solutions. So just in 3 minutes, Rodolfo, I think what Siale was saying links into a question I was going to ask you, which is about your belief that the international economic system is one that favors the lenders. And I'm just wondering, what would you see are the pathways or steps that are necessary to take that shift away from a focus, a privileged lender position, to one that more balances with borrowers' rights?
It would take a big, it would take a big systemic change. I don't know if you hear me okay, but I'm hearing a lot of
we're hearing some static, but keep going.
Okay.
Keep going, Rodolfo.
I'll go ahead. Okay. We're saying we need like emergency action, amplifying the debt relief that has been so far offered, but then we need systemic changes, as you say, to switch this power balance to a natural power balance, power imbalance to power balance. For the moment, we need to secure participation of all creditors in debt relief offers, including the World Bank and especially all the multilateral development banks and especially private creditors, but also the extension of the relief measures to all developing countries in need. This means that the decision should be in the borrower countries to decide if they suspend payments or they request debt relief, and those borrowing countries should be protected in their rights to decide that they put the needs of their population and the communities before the payment of these external debts. But then for this systemic change, we need legislative changes to protect these borrowing countries, to prevent vulture funds and other lenders suing a government who's stopping their payments, actually fulfilling with human rights obligations. And for those structural reforms, we also need to build a system that is fair, that is transparent, where a country with debt problems can reach out, that is not governed by the IMF or the World Bank, who are at this moment both judges and lenders and part of the problem. So a multilateral framework for sovereign debt restructuring under, for instance, the UN auspices, but a more neutral body where the countries could solve their debt problems. To switch also this imbalance of powers, we have been asking for many years to promote binding rules on responsible sovereign lending and borrowing. So when the lending is done and the borrowing is done at the first moment, there should be some rules that put the community's needs and the environmental needs up front. I think, and also complementing what Siale was saying, the effort for debt audits that some countries, but especially civil society, have been made are a great complement to this community budgeting and transparency efforts that Siale was mentioning. So not before, but while doing this surveillance of from the communities to where the money is going, we should be able to audit what has been borrowed, what has been the destined of the borrowed money, which were the conditions, and if there is any illegitimate debt in there. And finally, we are also proposing a change in the approach to what we consider debt sustainability. So for the moment, and from the creditor's point of view, a debt is sustainable as soon as far as there is money to repay. They don't care if this money is more needed in the health system. If there is money, the debt is sustainable. So we need to change that and say a debt is not sustainable unless human rights are fulfilled, unless women's rights, indigenous communities' rights are fulfilled, unless the climate emergency has the funds that we need to tackle this emergency. So we need to integrate those financing needs for SDGs, for climate, for human rights, for gender commitments into what we consider debt sustainability.
Thanks, Iolanda. Yeah, we do have a lot of work. Rodolfo, I know that you wanted to add some thoughts to that as well.
Hi, thanks, Luke, and thanks, Iolanda. I'd just like to add very briefly that, yeah, in the short term, indeed, the cancellations are imperative, and I think civil society is already calling for cancellations, and this must be expanded to larger number of countries, and it's also an opportune time for bigger, even permanent cancellations. But at the same time, in the medium term and long term, IBON International thinks that cancellations must be bound up indeed with systemic change. Systemic change in the sense of tackling the power of the lenders. Well, who can we expect to tackle the power of the lenders and the debtor governments who accede to the lenders? Well, we think that social movements in our countries play a big role. And just to complement what Siale is saying about the development effectiveness principles, I think one important principle there is democratic ownership, wherein development decisions, financing decisions must be substantively influenced, even led by peoples that are affected by those decisions. So therefore, power relations must be tackled nationally as well to shift the power of towards the people and away from creditor interests. And finally, like what Iolanda is saying, we also must explore policy ways forward for international policy, given that it's a systemic problem, so that we could move away from debt dependence. No, aside from, again, this is premised that people that there is the right of the people to influence development paths in the global south. So to add on what Iolanda has been saying, indeed, so that countries won't be debt dependent, there's a need for more progressive taxation and not tax incentives for corporations. There is a need to rethink that financial integration dogma. There is a need to act against how development aid is being shaped increasingly to accommodate corporate interests. And there is a need to address the export commodity dependence of many southern countries and their reliance on remittances, precisely by building economies that are internally dynamic via strategic industrial policy and agricultural development. So yeah, in all of those policies, campaigning among movements in our respective countries is essential, as well as internationalism, so that our struggles are interlinked and strengthen each other. So I guess that's my brief, not so brief answer.
Thanks, Rodolfo. Mehedi, do you agree with this suite of solutions that have been offered, or is that how you and your colleagues are seeing it in Bangladesh?
Yeah, of course, I agree with Iolanda and Rodolfo. But one thing should be, I want to add that solution is actually cancelling the current debt installments now and immediately, Many civil society organizations, including Jubilee Movement, CADTM, many of them demanded to the IFIs and developed countries to cancel their loan repayments. And we also sent a letter to 33 bilateral and multilateral investors in Bangladesh. Among them, till date, no response from them. China has suspended installments of from 67 countries, including Bangladesh, but they also suspended the loan from loan of energy sector, which allows the dirty investors to invest more in dirty energy. Also, it is very important to reach the communities who are facing serious problems. So this 8.8 billion, which is government estimated money, could be come from 1.7 billion from the loan repayments, 1.2 billion from the dirty energy sector, and 2.3 billion already government has taken from the different IFIs. So that could be a good solution. That could be an appropriate solution now. That's my comment for now.
Thank you. Siale, just really briefly, do you have anything to add you've already mentioned the importance of accountability of lending and development aid. Do you have anything to add to those suite of solutions that have been mentioned?
Thank you, Luke. It's just a quick observation that we had seen in terms of the immediate response in countries, that we have started seeing our own government releasing fund to access by communities are actually put through banks. Yeah, and then our small community, small scale farmers who doesn't have any relationship with the bank ended up not accessing the fund. So, in support of the debt relief in terms of to ease things out with our government, it must be accompanied by the development effectiveness principles. It must be accompanied by a more open government, and it must be accompanied by a civic space that allow for civil society to be holding, to hold the whole principle of democracy, hold our electoral leaders accountable and transparent, so that people can see, because we are up to a stage where everyone has to come to the table and define what's the new normal should look like.
Thanks, Siale. Look, it's really good to have this sort of agreement on solutions, although the solutions are going to be difficult to achieve, and I think there's a lot of political challenges in terms of trying to bring people along to see the sorts of solutions that I think we're all in agreement of. And just speaking of that, I want to sort of open it up to the Q&A, but we don't have any questions in the chat yet, so I might start with the first question. And I'm going to ask a question to Iolanda, and that is that, you've been a debt campaigner for over 2 decades now, and you've seen the previous crisis, you've seen now the problem re-emerging. I mean, it never really went away, as we know, but it's becoming more apparent again. I'm just wondering, what is it that you think we can learn as economic justice campaigners from the last crisis that we went through, and are there lessons that we can apply? Not to say that there wasn't some successes in the previous debt campaign, but there were some successes, but also some failures, I think it's fair to say. So what is it that we can learn from what happened last time for this time around?
There are many things, but I think I will highlight 2. One, on the civil society, social movement side, is that we can get results when we work together. And in the last decade, we haven't seen a very active debt movement, but since the COVID-19 crisis started, the debt community was there, and we've come together, and I think we have to kind of redouble our efforts to give coordinated responses. But yeah, a strong debt debt movement would be a must, and that is a learning from 2000s, but also from the crisis in Europe, for example, the debt crisis in Europe, and we didn't have social movements that were strong enough and united enough to tackle that crisis from that side. But then the other, from the policy side, would be that without these systemic changes and changes in the economic system that the rest of the panelists have been talking, debt cancellation can only bring the system to a restart, and then the problem will be there. Changes in the way that system works, but also in the economic system as a whole. The solutions that we can provide with debt relief now will be temporary solutions. So we need to work together for more systemic solutions.
Thanks, Iolanda. I'm just wondering if anybody else in any of the other 34 attendees has any questions for the panelists. If you do, it's your last chance to put them in the chat or raise your hand. I've got one question from Barry Lally. Hello, Barry. The question is, can we work with those people and organizations which appear to be growing to address the debt issues, including cancelling the debt? So does anybody want to have a go at answering Barry's question? Maybe given that Barry's in the Pacific, maybe Siale, would you like to have a go at answering that one?
Thank you, and thank you, Barry, for the questions. I think what is important in the discussions of debt relief is that is to ease the pressure that some of our Pacific government are facing right now because of the impact of the shutdown, impact of the closing borders. The remittances is affected. Tourism is also a huge impact in terms of people losing jobs. But as Iolanda was saying, it should not be just like a one-off. It should be looked at as a more systemic solution to find in terms of we don't, and that's where we are saying we need to look into that, to be accompanied by good governance, accompanied by due diligence, because we don't want to let them pass this round not paying their debt, and then they continue practicing the corruptive practices that ended up why we are here in the first place. So I think it's a much more complicated process, but at the same time we just have to hold our leaders accountable, and that's where the role of civil society is just so important.
Thanks, Siale. So we've got a couple of, at least one, maybe two questions from Agatha and Susan. So I wonder, given that the time, I wonder if we could just ask both those questions to the panel back to back. So Agatha, do you want to go first, and then maybe Susan, and then we'll have some answers to those two questions. So go ahead, Agatha.
Luke, I can jump in while we're waiting for Agatha.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say thank you to the panel. What a wonderful discussion, and such a privilege to hear firsthand about experiences and what's going on. I've got a particular interest in the World Bank, and so they've been front-loading their grant relief, which has been quite positive, and they've actually been funding states to fund public services, actually to fund healthcare workers, not just to tender everything out. That's all good, but the loans are coming in the next round. But developing states, my question, to get to the question, developing states, are there any other options but to take those loans? Should they take, should you take them? Should they take them? And how can we ensure that 6 months down the track or 2 years down the track, we won't see the return to austerity, cutting healthcare, cutting public services that we saw after the global financial crisis? Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. Agatha, if you're still there, if you want to try and unmute yourself, then we might be able to hear you and hear your question. All right, so let's go to Susan's question. Who would like to, it's a really specific question about the World Bank loans and whether, two questions really, whether developing countries should take those loans given that they're providing relief but creating more debt, and also the more general question of who would like to have a go at answering that.
Perhaps I could have a go at it.
Fantastic, thanks.
Thanks, Luke and Susan. Perhaps I could talk a bit about the Philippine case in particular, where indeed the Philippine government has taken a recent World Bank, well, not just one, 3 World Bank loans worth $1.1 billion, supposedly for well, economic recovery and COVID response. But indeed, I saw in this Philippine case that even though the government took the loan and increased the debt of external debt, public external debt, whether or not these loans benefit people, the communities, is another important question that we have to ask now. Because in the Philippines, for instance, there is actually a big controversy because the government has been racking up new loans. The government has been racking up new loans, but the poverty is still worsening, the unemployment is still increasing, and indeed there are questions of where is the money going. So indeed there are these national peculiarities that we have to also and consider when we are asking that question of should developing countries in general receive loans. We should precisely look at the character of the governments, and indeed to jump into what Susan added to the comment. I saw her write a comment as well, because I think that's also pertinent to answering her question, that indeed there is that question of shifting the power from capital to labor in such countries. That is more an important question when we are asking the question of debt relief and new loans for southern governments. So that's my short take of it. Thanks.
Thanks, Rodolfo. We were just having a bit of interference there, but I think that wasn't at your end. I think it was because we had too many people unmuted. So just to, we're going to take one more question, and then there's a request for information, which I'll answer in a sec. But the final question, given we're running out of time, is about the Busan principles, the insufficiency of the implementation of the Busan principles. The question is, what is the reason why the mandate given at Busan has not been effectively used? And what are the lessons learned from this process, and what can be done better? So would any of our panelists like to have a go at answering that question?
Look, maybe I can answer that because I probably was the one that that mentioned it. And what I was saying is that at the global level, that is already being recognized as civil society development actors in our own right? And so that comes with understanding that government should be at the national level, provide the enabling environment for civil society to be part of development conversations. right from the discussions, right from the consultations, right from making sure that our indigenous communities, that our communities are part of development conversations on defining what's the priorities that our country should be part of, and that was what I meant, that we haven't seen that corporate accepting civil society as development actors in our own right have not been translated for us to see that a more accepting, more understanding of the role of civil society at the national level. The other one that I just want to make a point was to Susan questions, and I just want to respond in the sense that the World Bank in ADB and others, if we just like reflect back, has been involved in a lot of our Pacific countries' public sector reform, and that has seen a different form of our public services. And you have seen that in the COVID-19, where it exposes, it just exposed the health system, our agriculture sector, where there was a big reform. They say cut down the numbers of our civil servants. In the first cut were usually our extension services. Yeah, and so we now see that our community clinics are no longer being managed by qualified doctors and you know, in our extension services that support community in terms of innovating farming and encouraging them to apply their traditional knowledge in farming, has been the first cut when this whole public sector reform. We have also seen the public utilities has been corporatized, and now you can't access water without paying for it. Yeah, and so those are the things that we don't want. We don't want to see that repeated as we're trying to see what's the next step in terms of our recovery and in terms of aid.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Siale, and I know that Susan would wholeheartedly agree with all of that. I think it's time to wrap. I would like to just answer Phil Jones's question about the best place to get data. Thank you for that question, Phil. Iolanda, would you? I think the Eurodad website is a great reservoir of information and data. So I think you're probably too modest to say that, but I wonder if you might suggest any other places for Phil to go for getting the latest numbers and figures.
Yeah, of course, the civil society organizations, that is one, but Jubilee Tech Campaign is also doing great data crunching, and Jubilee Germany. Of course, I know more the European networks and organizations. In July is this G20 meeting, and we will publish new data that we are analyzing now. So that's one thing. And then the other is the World Bank just published the data on debt relief. I think I can share in the chat the link. I mean, normally the IMF and the World Bank are the ones providing the most updated data. It's not as updated as we would like and not as detailed as we would like, but that's what we saw so far.
Great, thanks, Iolanda. So look, we're actually at 90 minutes, so I think it's time to really bring this excellent discussion to an end. And it's been great to have so many of you join. I understand there's not just the attendees on the call, but other people watching the stream on YouTube. So we've had a really good attendance, so thank you. I'm just going to go through and thank all the speakers in turn. And just remind you who they are. So Hasan Mehedi from the Bangladesh Working Group on External Debt and CLEAN, the Coastal Livelihood and Environmental Action Network in Bangladesh. Iolanda Fresnillo from the European Network on Debt and Development, or Eurodad. Rodolfo Lahoy Jr. from IBON International. And Emeline Siale Ilolahia from PIANGO, the Pacific Island Association for Non-Government Organisations. Thank you so much to all of you for preparing and delivering such excellent talks today and for this really interesting discussion. I want to thank Sarah Torres from Reality of Aid Asia Pacific, and a big shout out to Natalie Lowry and Mara Bonucci from AidWatch, who along with Reality of Aid Network are the hosts of this series of Aid Talks. I'm sure there'll be, I imagine there will be more Aid Talks webinars to follow in the coming months, so keep an ear out for that. And I don't know if Sarah, if you wanted to say anything in farewell or...
Your conclusion is enough to
Thanks, Sarah. Well, have a great evening or morning or afternoon wherever you are, and thanks again, everyone. And we will, I guess, we'll hopefully see each other all in person again one day when we can travel again. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day, a great evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, people are dropping out. Sarah, do you like to do a debrief afterwards, or?
Yes, we can. We also did that before.
We should probably, this is still live on YouTube and recording. Do you want to?